Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am sorry we start a little bit late, and I'm sorry the music already stopped because I thought it was beautiful. And we've been listening to Ken Gold and Jeroen Zarpati, and they made a special repertoire for tonight. They sang songs about communications and titled the program, "I Only Sing This Because I Love You." I would like to thank them again for these beautiful songs, and maybe they can get a little applause extra. Dear ladies and gentlemen, I would like to welcome you all here tonight for tonight's lecture with Deborah Tannen. My name is Monique Knapen, and as director of the John Adams Institute, I'm very proud we have Dr. Tannen for a second time in our program. In June 1995, she spoke in the Koepelzaal, and tonight she's speaking again in this beautiful church. This Lutheran church is the auditorium of the University of Amsterdam, and the John Adams Institute is very pleased with the cooperation we have with this wonderful university. We organized a lecture here last June about the differences in integration of immigrants in Amsterdam compared to New York City. In future, we will continue to jointly bring you more lectures with outstanding Americans. Dr. Tannen belongs to this category. As professor of linguistics at Georgetown University, she has made remarkable contributions to our different styles of communication of men and women at home, at work, and in personal relationships. I will not say more since we have another person of distinction in our midst who will introduce our guest speaker tonight. This person I am talking about is former ambassador of the United States to the Netherlands, Cynthia Schneider. Dr. Cynthia Schneider, I should say. Dr. Schneider is an art historian and presently teaching art history at Georgetown University. Not only are Dr. Schneider and Dr. Tannen colleagues, they are good friends too. In a moment, I will ask Dr. Schneider to briefly introduce Dr. Tannen. Hereafter, Dr. Tannen will talk for about 35 minutes. After his speech, Dr. Schneider will initiate the debate and discussion. At a certain moment, she will invite you to take part of the discussion as well, and there are microphones in the aisles. There will be no intermission tonight, and Dr. Tannen is willing to sign her books after I close the evening at around 9:30, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that later on. Cynthia, may I ask you to take the floor, and in the meantime, please switch off your mobile phones and refrain from smoking. Thank you so much.
Ja, goedenavond. Het is voor mij een grote plezier terug in Nederland te zijn. Overal met mijn vriendin en collega Dr. Deborah Tannen. Als zij spreekt in het Nederlands, ik ga verder in het Engels. I think that Deborah Tannen is a really extraordinary person in the academic world or any world. She stands virtually alone as someone who is very distinguished as a scholar in her field, linguistics, not something that you think of as being particularly accessible to the man and woman on the street. But not only that, she has been able to take her extraordinary expertise and translate it into the language of everyday life, and to write books that speak to an extraordinary range of people. Witness all of you here, this book is translated into Dutch. Her first book, You Just Don't Understand, has been translated into 26 languages, spent 4 years on the New York Times bestseller list. And I think this book, as is true of that book, the minute you hear the title, I only say this because I love you, every single person in this room relates to that and thinks of some incident in their own family to which that statement might pertain. I think I will just spend just a minute telling you about how I met Dr. Tannen at Georgetown, because I think it says a great deal about her and her engagement with contemporary issues. Although we taught at the same university, we didn't know each other personally until a few years ago. And that was when I heard her give a talk right at the beginning of the 1992 presidential campaign. And this was a time when there were a great many negative articles about Hillary Clinton, and there was a lot of this, who is this person, who does she think she is, why is she so difficult, why is she so humorless and domineering, da-da-da-da. And I was thinking a lot about what I could do to help this situation or turn it around. And I listened to Dr. Tannen give a talk on You Just Don't Understand at Georgetown, and I thought, that is it. She needs to write an article about language and to explain why certain people are feeling so antagonistic towards Hillary Clinton, because she is speaking in a way that certain people are finding uncomfortable hearing from the mouth of a female. So I left her this long voicemail message. She was then teaching at Stanford, and she went back to Stanford, and I thought, this is hopeless. She's never going to answer this voicemail. And we began a friendship via voicemail. I think we exchanged many, many voicemails before we actually spoke to each other. But she thought this was a great idea, and sure enough wrote an excellent editorial for the New York Times, which was very influential in the way people looked and then began to re-look at the way Hillary Clinton was speaking. She then went on after that to look at the general tenor of public discourse in America, and I think it can be applied to other countries as well, in her book, The Argument Culture, where she talks about the way we tend to address issues in an adversarial way. But I think, in a way, the strongest testament that I have ever witnessed to the degree to which Dr. Tannen has really permeated the lives of so many people with her books happened to me once near my house in Maryland when I was at a store, and a young man came into the store, I would say sort of slouched into the store, wearing extremely baggy blue jeans that were just, you just hoped that they would stay up. They were just hanging by a whisper in a prayer. And he kind of slouching in like this, and I'm thinking, and then I looked a little closer, and hanging out of the back pocket of these enormous blue jeans was a copy of You Just Don't Understand. And I could just imagine the scene of his girlfriend saying to him, that is it. You go away and read this book, and I am not talking to you until you come back having finished it. Any academic who can excel in her own field and speak to such a broad audience is truly extraordinary, and I think we are all going to feel some resonance with what Dr. Tannen says to us tonight. Welcome, Deborah.
Thank you so much. It's a tremendous honor to be introduced by such an illustrious person, and a treat that it's also someone I'm so fond of. Pleasure to be here again. I last spoke to the John Adams audience in 1995, so it's 6 years, 3 books, two books. Just to say really quickly how I happened to write this book following on the books before, because as I've been interviewed by journalists here, that's always the first question that they ask me. Why did you write this book now? So just to really quickly recap, when I got my degree in linguistics and began seeing how language can affect everyday relationships, and I felt that psychologists had been much more effective at communicating to a broader audience than linguists had been. I wrote a book called That's Not What I Meant, to bring to a wider audience the kinds of insights I was having in my academic work. That book had 1 chapter on women and men, and the interest in the male-female chapter was way out of proportion to the interest that the book had in general. So I then wrote a book about communication between women and men, and that was the book entitled You Just Don't Understand. I think if I had suspected how many people were going to read that book, I would have developed an enormous writer's block. I don't think I would have been able to write it. But I was unsuspecting, and I wrote that book. After the book about women and men communicating, I wrote Talking from 9 to 5, which was women and men at work. And partly because of the response that I had gotten to that book, both in the academic world and also in the world at large, I wrote the book, The Argument Culture, about our tendency to put everything in an adversarial spirit. So, for example, in my mind, You Just Didn't Understand was a kind of a peace treaty between women and men. It was a way to say we don't have to be enemies if we understand each other. And again, articles about the book or reviews of it or forums on which I was speaking, it would say the battle of the sexes, the war between the sexes. So that inspired the book, The Argument Culture. Well, I realized then that I had gotten farther and farther from what is really my true love, that is how language affects close relationships. So I really wanted to get back to a book about close relationships. So why adult families? Because this book is about family communication, but it isn't so much the nuclear family as it is adult families, adult brothers and sisters, parents and adult children, older adult parents, teenagers, because they're beginning to be adults, and in-laws. So in a way, it was my own place in life, reaching the 50s and seeing that I still had conflicts with my sisters, with my parents, hearing from my friends and my sisters about their frustrations with their adult children. But also realizing that our families continue to be our families and affect how we not only communicate with them, but communicate with everybody else throughout our lives. It has taken special significance, I think, since September 11th. Since that terrible day, it's impossible to really to look at anything the same way. But something that struck me is how many people on September 11th in the United States, perhaps here as well, immediately wanted to talk to their families. Even if you knew, now I live in Washington and I'm from New York, so I have family up there, immediately wanted to talk to my parents, get my husband on the phone, my sisters called me, my parents called me, I called my best friend, but we all just wanted to touch base with our families. There's something about that immediate family relationship that continues even after you're adults and move out of the house. So I think that really reinforced that this topic is one that continues to be important. I want to talk about some of the distinctions that I make here that can be significant in family relationships. And I'm going to start right from the beginning with an example, because examples are always the easiest to conceptualize. Imagine this scene. A couple goes to the restaurant, and the man opens the menu, and he looks at it, and he says, I'm going to have the steak, maybe filet mignon. And the wife says, did you notice, dear, they also have salmon? You like salmon. And he complains, will you please stop criticizing everything I eat? And she feels unjustly accused, and she says, I didn't criticize. I just pointed out something you would like. Well, who's right here? Did she criticize or not? The message level is just, and I make a distinction between the message level, which is the meaning of the words, and the meta-message level, which is what we think it means about our relationship that you say this in these words at this time. And sometimes the meta-message comes not from anything you said, but from our history together, especially in the family where we have such a long history. Well, the message level is just pointing out something he might like. That's true. But the meta-message level is something else. And when this anecdote was told to me by the woman, and when she told me the story, she said, I didn't criticize, I just pointed out something he'd like. And I said, well, supposing he had said, I'm going to have salmon. Do you think you would have said, did you notice, dear, they also have steak? You like steak. And she admitted no, she probably wouldn't have, and admitted, therefore, that the reason she said it was that she wasn't so happy with what he ordered. So the meta-message that he hears, you're not happy with what I ordered, is valid. But the meta-message that she's aware of is also valid, and that is, I only say this because I love you. She loves him. She doesn't want him to die of a heart attack. She'd like to keep him around as long as she can. And so she has good reason for being concerned if he eats too much steak. But the cumulative effect of living with someone who is always watching what you eat and telling you that you should eat something else can wear you down. And it isn't only what you eat. Another example, I don't know how excited people are here about recycling, but there are certain people of us in the United States that are very enthusiastic about recycling. And this was a couple, they both agreed recycling was a good thing, but one day he appeared before her holding the cardboard cylinder that comes from the center of a roll of toilet paper. And he held it up and he said, "This is recyclable. I found it in the garbage." And she made a complaint and said, "I don't think it's a good idea for you to go through the garbage looking for things I threw away that you think should be recyclable." And then she said, "Our relationship is more important than that." And he said, "I'm not talking about our relationship. I'm just talking about recycling." Well, message and meta-message. The message is just about recycling, but the meta-message is about the relationship. Just as you don't want someone watching what you eat, you don't want someone checking your garbage. And so it's the feeling of living with, nobody wants to live with the recycling police, or the diet police, or the neatness police. Maybe you have different ideas about the level of neatness that is appropriate. But this is one of the dangers of living with other people. And there are two, you can live with your dog, he wouldn't give you a problem like that. There are two big categories of double meaning that affect so much of what we say in the family. One is the double meaning of caring and criticizing. And maybe that's what's captured in the title. Because we care about each other, we have opinions about what the other person does, how they function, how they lead their lives. So we give advice, we make suggestions, we offer help. But any time you give advice, make a suggestion, or offer help, there is always an implied criticism. Because if you were doing everything right, you wouldn't need advice, help, or a suggestion. So there's always an implied criticism. If we assume that every statement has one meaning, then we end up in a conflict where one person sees only one meta-message and the other sees only the other. So you get the complaint, and this comes up very frequently between mothers and adult daughters, where the mother, in one case, sent the daughter a clipping. The post office was the mother's ally. She would send the daughter clippings all the time. She sent her a clipping with a picture and a note, "I think this hairstyle would look good on you." And the mother feels the meta-message is help, and the daughter feels, "My mother thinks my hair looks terrible the way it is." Between mothers and daughters, frequently the meta-messages of criticism seem to be about appearance, hairstyle, clothing, and weight. And sometimes also how she raises her own children, if the daughter has children. So the mother is aware of the meta-message, "I'm just being helpful," and the daughter feels the meta-message, "You're always criticizing." One woman told me that her mother would say to her, "Well, you should ask Sally where she gets her shoes." She heard the meta-message, "Sally knows how to dress and I don't." And on some level, you know that it's about caring. I'll give a personal example here. My mother is 90. Throughout the book, I have examples of my own parents. My mother is 90, and she's forgetful now, and she isn't all that well. And the last time, a couple times ago, I visited her, and she was sitting looking so vulnerable and weak on the couch, and then she looked at me and she said, "Your hair needs a trim." And then her eyes went down to the floor, and she said, "When's the last time you polished your shoes?" And I have to say that I was pleased, because it was like she's still there. She's still same old mother. And because she's 90 and I don't know how long I'll have her, that was to me heartwarming. Because you have to wait till your mother's 90 before you find it heartwarming. So the double message of caring and criticizing is always there. Now, that's the perspective of the either adult daughter or whoever is that's feeling criticized is you focus on the criticism. But I remember being told by a woman, a middle-aged woman, that she, when her daughter was a teenager, they had no conflict, and she thought they never would. And she said, now my daughter's 35, I can't open my mouth. She takes everything as criticism. And that's the other side of it. The person who feels they're just being helpful and wonders why are you so, take everything as criticism. Can you all hear me? Yeah. So the distinction between message and meta-message is an important one. The double meaning of caring and criticizing very frequently runs through family conflicts. Another double meaning that constantly comes up when you're trying to live in close proximity with someone is the double meaning of control and connection. We all want to be free. We don't want to feel that somebody's controlling us, but we want to be connected. We don't want to feel alone in the world. Well, being connected means you're not completely free, because what you do affects the other person. For example, one person says, I'm going to take a walk. And the other one says, oh, I'd like to go with you, but I have to make a phone call first. So could you wait about 10 minutes? Now, is this connection? We're going to walk together, or is it control? You're not free to take a walk when you feel like it. Well, it's both, and you can't separate them. But when this conversation happens, as it often happens, a conversation like it, between two people who live together, typically one sees only control. I can't take a walk when I want to. It's just so frustrating. And the other feels only the connection level. What's the matter with you? You don't want to wait for me. Are you afraid of commitment? You don't love me as much as I love you? Or, if the person says, I'm going to take a walk, you're already offended because he should have said, would you like to come? So if you look at it from the point of view of connection, then obviously we should walk together. If you look at it from the point of view of freedom from control, obviously I shouldn't have to wait for you. And you end up in an argument typically where one sees only connection and one sees only control. So in a way, everything that you write about in this book has the theme that if we can see that words don't have just one meaning, that they have many levels of meaning. So you can hold on to your good intentions without denying what the other person thinks you meant or what they felt. If you are aware of other books I've written, you've probably come across the concept of message and meta-message, and I've talked about these conflicts between connection and control in other books. So I want to mention now a theme or a concept that I have not discussed in other books, and that's the concept of alignment. A family, in a way, is a constant kaleidoscope of shifting alignments, connections, alliances, antagonisms that put two or more people in the family in direct relation to each other and leave somebody else out. And I'm going to give an example that's from my own life. As I said, the book is kind of peppered with examples from my own life to illustrate this concept of alignment. And I think if I had the concept at the time, I probably could have solved this a bit more readily. I have two sisters. One is 2 years older than I, and the other is 8 years older. And when I was, just a brief summary of my life story here, when I was 21, I went to Greece, met a man in Greece. At 23, we got married, and when I was 29, we separated. And I met the man that I'm now married to when I was 40. Now, in case you want to fill it all in, I'm 56 now, so you know the whole story. So between the ages of 29 and 40, I was single. And my mother was beside herself. She thought she had 3 married daughters, and within the space of a few months, she ended up with 3 single daughters. But my 2 older sisters remarried rather quickly, and I remained unmarried. And my mother was so upset, so concerned. And every time I talked to her, she would say something to call attention to this. So, for example, if she asked me, it was a Saturday night, what are you doing tonight? And I said, I'm just going to have dinner with my best friend. She would be very upset and ask why I didn't have a date. Or if I introduced her to a friend of mine who was male, and she would say, is he your boyfriend? And I'd say, no, it's just a friend. Why, is he gay? of course, that offended me on two levels. First of all, that everyone has to be a boyfriend, but secondly, that he had to reject me if he wasn't my boyfriend. It couldn't be that I wasn't interested in him that way. Oh, and the one I remember always sticks in my mind. My parents drove down from New York to Washington, and I had a good job at Georgetown, and I was a successful academic, and I had a little house that I rented that I had furnished, and I was felt, my life was so well organized. They were going to be so impressed, and we had a nice visit, and then they left, and my mother called, and I was sure she was going to say, "It's so wonderful to see you doing so well." What she said was, "When Daddy and I drove away and saw you standing all by yourself in front of your house, I felt so bad for you." So she had reframed what I saw as my successful life into a pitiable life. So this was a constant theme with my mother. And I would, depending on my mood, I would plead, I would beg, I would cry, I would yell. But I would try to get her to stop talking about her concern that I wasn't married. And she would really try. She would, really try. And sometimes for several weeks at a time, there would be no reference to it. And I would think, oh, good, she finally has stopped worrying about me. And then my sister would call. And my sister would say, "Oh, Mother called me last night. She's so worried about your not being married. She hasn't been able to sleep." And then she would say, "But I told her she shouldn't worry about you. You have such a good life, and you love your work, and you have so many friends." And oh yeah, one of my mother's obsessions was that I kept going off to academic meetings when she thought I should go to Club Med in Tahiti so I could find a husband. And my sister would say, "And I told her you have a much better chance of finding a husband at an academic meeting than on the beach in Tahiti." And in fact, that was prophetic. I did find my husband at an academic meeting. But my sister would tell me this, and she would expect me to be happy, and I would always be upset with her because it would make me feel worse. It would remind me how terrible my mother felt about it. And what was so hurtful was the alignment. The image of my mother and my sister having these heart-to-heart talks about me, the family problem, so I become just a problem to be talked about. That was what was so hurtful, but I didn't have the concept of alignment at that time. And so I couldn't explain to my sister why it was so hurtful, and so I couldn't get her to stop. She would keep doing it because she could not understand why I wouldn't thank her. She really thought I should thank her because she stood up for me. And in fact, she was right. Everything she said was right. I just didn't want her to repeat it to me. I would have liked her to tell my mother and just keep it between them. I think if I had had the concept of alignment at the time, I could have explained it to her in a way that she would have understood. As a side point, I have to say, my sister and I are very good friends, although we do have conflicts, and I have examples throughout the book of her. Some identify it as her, some I don't identify it as her. But when she read this book and she saw she was in it, and I said, are you okay with all the examples that I'm using of you? And she said, yes. She said, I'm not that proud of that story, but you can use it. But I meant well, don't you? You know I didn't mean to hurt you. And I said, I do know. And she said, okay, then you can use it. Just a quick example of how the concept of alignment can be helpful. A man who read the book commented to me that right after he read the book, in his family, his teenage son and the mother were often in conflict, but he got along quite well with his son. But the mother resented this. She felt that her son and her husband were somehow in cahoots and ganging up on her. The husband was the good guy and she was the bad guy. Well, very soon after he read the book, something happened where his son came to him and told him about a conflict with the mother. And he was just about to do what he would normally have done, which is go to his wife and tell her, our son told me this, and I think if you handled it this way, it would be better. And then he caught himself and he realized that the damage that would be done by the alignment created would be more hurtful than any advice he offered could be helpful. His wife would hear it as, you and our son are ganging up on me again. It's again that alignment, that image of the two of them talking about her. And so he decided he wasn't going to do that, and instead he went directly to the son and discussed with him how he could deal with his mother directly. So having that concept of alignment was very helpful. Anytime you say something to a family member and say, don't tell so-and-so, there's a possible alignment problem coming up. I want to say something about apologies, because I have a whole chapter on apologies. I discuss apologies in every book because it is so pervasive in human communication. But when I was talking to families and looking at transcripts of family arguments, it was amazing how frequently apologies became relevant. And most of the book doesn't focus on gender, on the male-female particularly, but the apology chapter does, because frustrations over apologies tend to be like this. Couple live together out in the country. One day the man is going out, the woman is not, so she gives him a letter to mail and stresses it's very important that it be mailed today, and he agrees. And then the next day they leave together, they step in the car, and there's her letter on the seat. And they both spy it at the same moment, and he says, oh, I forgot to mail your letter. And she's waiting for him to continue and say, I'm so sorry. And he doesn't say it. And pretty soon they're arguing about not the letter, but the apology. And she's thinking, what is such a big deal? You made a mistake, why don't you just say, I'm sorry? And he is thinking, what is such a big deal? I made a small mistake, but it's as if I committed a misdemeanor and you want to prosecute me for a felony. It's not such a big error, and they can't straighten it out. It was amazing to me how many arguments within families started where a woman expected an apology and the man didn't want to give it. And now when I talk about my own family, frequently there are many things about my husband and about me that are not typical of women and men, but this is one way in which we are absolutely typical, where I just get in a total state because he won't just say he's sorry, and he doesn't understand why I'm insisting on an apology. I kind of began to understand the difference. There was a movie called The Kid. I don't know if it was here, and if it was, if any of you saw it. But in this movie, the actor Bruce Willis plays a man of about 40 who's seeing a little kid appear all the time. And suddenly it turns out this child is himself at the age of 8. And together they go back to a scene from his childhood when he was 8 that was pivotal in his childhood. He allowed himself to be beaten up by the class bully. And after that, his life was miserable because the kids had him pegged as a kid you could beat up. And so he was pushed around and made miserable for the rest of his life in that town until he went away to the university. So Bruce Willis takes his 8-year-old self into the present and teaches him how to fight. And then they go back to the scene when he was 8. Aren't there scenes you would like to go back to when you were 8 and just do them over? Well, he gets to do that, and he beats up the bully. And then what happens in this scene? 8-year-old hero has the bully pinned on the ground, and he's choking him, and he says, apologize. And the little boy is being choked. He says, no. So he chokes him more, apologize. And he says, I'm sorry. And his defeat is sealed, and the triumph of our hero is sealed, and he's going to live happily ever after. And I thought, oh my goodness, no wonder my husband doesn't want to apologize. Very frequently, among boys and among men, demanding that somebody apologize is a kind of public degradation. You have caught him in a mistake, you've triumphed over him, and you want to exploit that triumph and rub his nose in it and make sure that your triumph continues into the future. And I think very often, not that we think these things through, of course we don't think them through, but I think for many men there's a feeling that you caught him in a mistake, and if you insist he apologize, you're trying to humiliate him in some way. So I have lots more to say about apologies, but it really does seem to carry different meta messages for the typical woman, the typical man, where for the man, the apology has the meta message of exploiting a weakness to get dominance, and for many women, the meta message is caring. If you won't apologize, it's as if you don't care that you let me down. And when you're stuck in these different interpretations, it's very hard to work it out. The solution, I will never say one is good, one is bad, one's right, one is wrong, but one possible solution is for the man or whoever it is that doesn't like to apologize to try it. See what happens. One thing my husband does sometimes, and this is rather unique, but he'll suddenly get a grin on his face and he'll say, "I apologize for everything." Which is a very creative way of apologizing, but not apologizing, because if you apologize for everything, you're not apologizing for a specific thing. A good thing about that is that it introduces a note of humor, and that's always good, and usually it makes me laugh. But another possibility, and many men tell me that it's a miracle when they try it to realize that you say, "I'm sorry," and it's over. This is amazing. It doesn't mean you can keep doing it again. But at the same time, I suggest that we women could really become attuned to other ways that men might say they're sorry. So for example, a neighbor of mine owed me an apology and he wrote me a note. I guess I wasn't much help. And I think in the past I would have said, "That's not an apology." But having written the book, I decided, or maybe I was doing the research at the time, I realized, yeah, that's an apology, and I'll just take it as that. And it's quite parallel to another situation where women may often be somewhat more indirect in getting someone to do something. And I have an example in the book of a mother and a teenage son. Son came home for Christmas, and it was a cold climate, and they're sitting at breakfast, they look out the window, it snowed during the night, and the mother says something about how thick the snow is, how long it's going to take to shovel it, and her son agrees, he can see the same snow, and then he goes and turns on the television. And then later the mother is angry and she's banging things around and she confronts him, what a lazy thing he is. She's working, he's watching television, and then she says, "The least you could have done would be to shovel the snow like I asked you to." And he feels very incensed. "You didn't ask me to. If you had asked me to, I would have done it." Now, you might think he should have known to shovel the snow without being asked. That's another thing. But he really felt she didn't ask, and she really felt she did, because she called attention to it. I was being interviewed by a journalist one time who commented, I gave an example, something like that, and he said, "You know, sometimes my wife says something like that, and I know what she wants, but I won't do it because she didn't ask in the right way." Now, you hear this and you might think, what a jerk. But it occurred to me when he said that, isn't that the same thing that I do when I know my husband is sorry, but I'm not going to accept it until he says it right? Until he actually says the words, "I'm sorry, I apologize, I made a mistake, I was wrong." And I realized that if I expect people of different conversational styles to become attuned to the way other people mean what they say, another solution to this is for women to become more attuned to other ways that men indicate that they're sorry without needing to hear just those words. This is an example that parallels by gender, and I said not patterns by gender. Not everything that I write about does pattern by gender, but some things do, and I'll give you one or two other examples that where I think it makes a big difference whether you have brothers or sisters in the house. So if you're a mother of adult sons or a mother of adult daughters, it really can make a difference. I was sitting with my parents in their dining room some years ago, and they were planning a trip. And my mother and I were talking round and round and round about a trip they were planning to California. And she was saying, you know, should we fly to Los Angeles and then go to San Francisco, or fly to San Francisco and then go to Los Angeles? How many days should we spend in each place? Should we travel by bus or by car or by plane between the city? All kinds of things. And we were talking. And then suddenly my mother turned to my father, who had been sitting silently there, and said, "Eli, we have to make a decision." And my father said, "How can you make a decision if you keep talking?" And I think because I was a daughter, I was having this conversation with my mother, and my father was left out. Had I been a son of the same age and my mother tried to get a conversation like that going, I probably would have wondered what she was going on about and said, make a decision. In fact, what my father did was he pulled over a piece of paper, drew an itinerary, and pushed it back and thought he had done what she wanted. He made the decision. And she pushed the itinerary aside and kept talking to me about, should we do this, should we do that? Because talking about it is part of the fun of planning the trip. I want to mention just one last thing, and then we'll go to our conversation with Cynthia Schneider. I have a lot to say here about adult siblings, and I think the favorite chapters, maybe there are 3 chapters that people seem to really like. Mothers and Daughters is one, Apologies is one, and the adult siblings is the other. That no matter what age we are, the age difference between siblings and the relationship we have in the family as siblings seems to always be a factor. So one of my favorite quotes was from a woman named Bessie Delaney, who commented about her sister Sadie. Sadie doesn't approve of me sometimes. She looks at me in that big sister sort of way. And when she said that, Bessie Delaney was 101, and her sister Sadie was 103. And I love this because it captured that you never, no matter how old you are, those 1, 2, 3, however many years difference between siblings stays there. And Sadie says later, and this comes from a book, Having Our Say, the first 100 years of the Delaney sisters. Sadie says, I have to stay alive to take care of Bessie. So if Bessie lives to 110, I'll just have to live to 112 so I can take care of her. And that's the lovely thing about an older sister and a younger sister, the taking care of, but the other side of it is the not approving. And in that sense, it's quite parallel to the parent-child relationship. No matter how old we are, we want that approval from our parents. And at a certain age, parents want the approval from their children. And you never can quite get it. In a sense, in the family, you expect your family member to be an intimate ally, someone on your side, who will always be looking out for you. And yet, it's also someone who is so close to you that they see all your faults, as if they see them through a magnifying glass. And so you find yourself not with an intimate ally, but an intimate critic. Someone looking at you so close up that they see all your faults and bring them to your attention, which maybe nobody else would do. And so the mother who says to her daughter, this hairstyle would look good on you, she would not walk up to a stranger in the street and show a picture from the newspaper and say, this hairdo would look good on you. And the irony is that if someone in the street did it, it wouldn't hurt your feelings. But when your mother does it, it does. And so that's what we have to balance in all our family relationships. And what I hope to do in this book is that by clarifying what some of these processes are and why they play out the way they do, the hope is that we can maximize the intimate ally aspect and minimize the intimate critic aspect. And so I'll stop there. Thank you. Thank you.
I think, we all found something to relate to there. I must say your discussion about your mother brought back to me memories of the period of probably up to 4 years when my mother would introduce me as her daughter, the eminent art historian, a museum curator or professor who's been married for 10 years and still doesn't have any children. And that, of course, led to me feeling when I did have children, luckily enough when actually we wanted to have children, thinking that she didn't spend enough time with them. If she was so desperate for them for so long, why wouldn't she spend any more time taking care of them? So these things they go on. I just think I have to tell all of you, I found myself wondering, after you write a book like this, how do you ever have a normal conversation with your husband? You sort of say, hello, how was your day? What do you mean by that?
And I have Those were the conversations we had before.
Right.
Now he knows what I mean.
But Deborah does have a wonderful husband, Michael, and they seem to have a lot of great conversations. I want to come back to the adult sibling thing and refer to something we've talked about before, because Deborah is the youngest sibling in her family, but then you're also the most famous sibling in your family. Tell us a little bit about how that has affected the interfamily relations.
I became a bit more successful, but I really was the family problem. I didn't go to grad school till much later. I graduated from college, and all I wanted to do was live abroad and have no discernible career. And my parents were tearing their hair, and I went off to Europe on a one-way ticket on Luxembourg Airlines when that was the cheapest airline, if some of you remember that. I think it is more, anytime you change the system in a family, people can get distressed. And the fact that I was the youngest sister and the problem, my oldest sister was very comfortable in the role of the one who had the approval. One story I sometimes like to tell, we are very close and we can talk about all these things, which I think makes it much easier. But after about a year after You Just Don't Understand was published, she said, you know, I did have a hard time with it, but I've worked it out and I'm fine with it now. You deserve your 15 minutes of fame. My microphone is, I think I turned it on. Should I move it closer?
Well, I think it should work. Yeah, and yeah, I think we all realize that to a certain degree we never.
But I will say something.
These.
I will say. Can you hear me now? I don't want to lean down. I'll just do this.
No, it's crazy. Oh wait. Go ahead. Try it now.
Is that working better? We just have one at a time. Is that okay now? I do want to say, people often ask me what I learned in writing this book and how it has changed my family relationship. I can't say it changed my relationship with my husband at all, but it has really improved my relationship with my oldest sister because it gave me much more compassion for her. And I'll give you a specific example. I have always resented her because she takes over. Any situation, you know, for years, she was the one who had the home and the family and the children, and I would go to her house and she would do the cooking and she would wait on me. And when I got old enough that I had my house, I was so happy that she would come to my house and I would cook dinner. And what would happen is she'd come to my house, go to the kitchen and start cooking dinner. And my reaction was to be angry at her. How dare she take over? She intruded, and I wouldn't say anything. I would just seethe. Maybe that's also younger sister, maybe it's just me. In doing the research for the book, I interviewed so many people about their families, and what I frequently heard from older sisters was their resentment that they had to do everything, that their siblings still expected them to do it all. And one woman I remember telling me how she was expected to go get her mother an hour's drive and take her to church, an hour drive back, and her younger sister lived right next to the mother, but she wouldn't do it. You know, she had to do it because she was the older one. And I suddenly realized that my sister might not want to do it all. Maybe she somehow felt obligated to do it. And the next time she came to my house and began doing things, I said, you know, Naomi, I really want to take care of you. You're always doing things for me. You sit down, you're on vacation, I'll do it. And she said, oh, well, I'm happy to help. No, I said, I want to wait on you. And she loved it. And afterwards she said she appreciated it so much, that it's so rare that somebody takes care of her. And I don't think she realized how hard she made it for people to take care of her, but she liked it. And I would say what I did was I was able to reframe it. I didn't attack her and say, I can't stand your taking over in my kitchen, how dare you do that, which is what I felt inside. But I reframed it to something that was positive, and it worked. But I don't think I would have thought of it if I hadn't done the research for the book. And she's read this. I've been asked that, you know, what change have you seen? And I said, it's given me more compassion for my older sister to realize that she was forced into that role of taking care of the younger kids, and then we resent her for it. And it's kind of a no-win situation that mothers in general get in, I think, where your children expect you to do everything and then they resent you for doing everything. So she said she appreciates that, and we're still really good friends.
Let's talk a little bit about apologies. It's one thing. We'll talk a little bit about apologies, which certainly was something that resonated with me, and I think probably, well, everyone. I mean, how many of us can remember how many sentences we begin with, well, I'm sorry, but, you know, when you probably have no particular reason to say you're sorry, but you just say it anyway, just to cover all the bases. It also, I think, gives you a certain kind of permission. So it's not always so generous. If you say I'm sorry, then you can, you know, come out with a zinger and it's okay because you apologize first. But that may be more of a kind of a female tactic. What about kind of pernicious apologies?
In that spirit, I'll just start with a quick aside that I recently heard Maya Angelou say, that when someone starts saying something with, don't take this wrong, but, she always stops them and says, I already did. And I think it would be better for you and me and the world if you didn't say it. I think apologies work in every possible way. Women do tend to say I'm sorry more often than men. Frequently, though, it's not an apology. It can often be, I'm sorry that happened. And it can be, so when somebody says something happened, oh, I'm sorry, it's not your fault. And we wonder, well, who said it was? We really didn't mean it as an apology. We meant, I'm sorry that happened. And many conversational rituals that are common among women are aimed out, taking the other person's experience into account, but you can interpret it as showing our internal state. Another example would be asking for everybody's opinion, and they think we're asking them to decide, but we're not. We're just getting their input. So I think often women are somewhat falsely accused of saying apologizing too much. But of course, if you think that by saying I'm sorry, you then can go do the same thing again, and then say I'm sorry, and then do it again, it's not going to work. You have a true apology has several elements. There should be some admission of fault. There should be some show of concern about the acknowledgement of what the other person suffered, and there should be some indication of reparations. You want to make up for it, and some indication you're not going to do it again.
There are also, I think, intercultural aspects to a lot of the things you raise. When you think about these books being read in 20-odd languages, and you think how might they be interpreted in these different cultures. I remember, I think, to me, the most amazing apology that I'm aware of happened not to me, but to the former director of the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston when I worked there, and the museum had a lot of relations with Japan, and we were always sending exhibitions over to Japan. And the director, actually Jan Fontaine, who does a lot of work here now, was having a drink in the hotel bar, and the bar stool broke. And he fell down, but he got up, he was okay, got on another stool, and he was fine. And he went and did some other things, and about 3 nights later, he came back and was having a drink at the bar, and he noticed that as soon as he walked in the door, the bartender sort of made a signal to someone. And he hadn't been there for a minute before this man came to attention in front of him and said, I represent the da-da-da Barstool Company, and I want to apologize for the deficiency of our bar stool. I mean, so there was someone who was really taking it very seriously.
The example of Japan frequently comes up as a country where apologies are used more frequently than they are in many countries in the West. And I like to use that as an example of how effective apologies can be. There's an example that I actually give in the book where Americans are frequently told by our insurance companies, and I don't know if this is true in Holland, our insurance companies tell us never apologize after a car accident because that puts you at fault and you could be sued. But the interesting thing is that research has actually shown that people are less likely to sue if they've gotten an apology, that frequently they sue because they want an apology. And there are numerous instances I have and examples I have of that. You may have read here, did you read about the lawsuit where the United States government sued Microsoft for being a monopoly? And the first judgment was extremely negative. Microsoft was told it was going to have to split up, although in the end it was reversed. But the judge in that case made statements to the public, to the press, and that's partly why it was overruled, because he talked too much to the press. But what he said was, the reason he was so severe in his punishment was because Microsoft never admitted fault. And it was so obvious that they had done something wrong and they didn't admit it, that he felt he really had to punish them. And I think many of us feel that. If you know someone's at fault and they refuse to apologize, you're more angry. And there's a last final example about Japan. Apparently in Japan, when there's a fender bender, a small car accident, both people apologize. And that's what's so wonderful about all these conversational rituals. If you both do it, nobody loses face. So apparently the ritual is you both apologize, but the one who's really at fault bows a little bit lower. So they know the system and it works. And he gives the example of an American who had a small car accident in Japan and refused to apologize. And the Japanese person actually sued him, which was very unusual because he was so incensed that he didn't have the good grace to apologize.
Another area you talk about, which I imagine resonates with a lot of people, is teenage children and the different kind of interaction that takes place when your children reach the teenage years, which my daughter just turned 13 a couple of months ago. And I was talking with her about this book on the way here, and there's a wonderful chapter on the family dinner when you ask, how was your day? And I was talking to her about that, and she looked at me accusingly, which she's known to do sometimes, and said, well, you never ask me how my day is anymore. And I said, well, that's because you always hated it when I did. And you always said you hated me to ask that, and you never wanted me to ask that at all, and when you wanted to tell me about your day, you would. She said, yeah, but I still like you to ask. And so...
That's the joy of the teenage years. I want to say something about that family dinner constellation that I write about a little bit. Several of my colleagues have done research on family dinner conversations, and one researcher, her name is Eleanor Oakes, tape-recorded families in different middle-class families, and she found a ritual that she called Father Knows Best, that the family would come together and the mother would ask the children, they would ask the father, how was your day? He'd say, fine. And then she would tell about her day, about a problem that happened, and then her husband would tell her how to solve the problem. And then she would say to her children, tell daddy what happened today, and the children would tell him, and he would judge it. You did well, you did badly, you should have done this, you should have done that. And Eleanor Oakes describes this as Father Knows Best. So there's kind of a hierarchy about who judges whom. So the father passes judgment on the mother's day, the mother passes judgment, the mother and father comment on the children's day. The children don't get to pass judgment on anybody's day, whether they were right or whether they were wrong. And she says that the mother sets the father up as judge. And I am pretty sure that what's happening is a cross-gender miscommunication, that when the mother says to the children, tell daddy how your day was, it's not that she is inviting her husband to judge, it's that she wants to involve him. But because the ritual of how was your day and what did you do and what did you think and what did you feel and what did that remind you of and what did that make you think and what did that is something that women are more likely to do than men as a way of feeling connected. And so I think the husband really thinks he's being told because he's asked to judge, but it probably was not the intention. So I think that's a kind of gender difference that can affect the whole family.
I think now, if you turn this, I think we'll turn to all of you now and give you a chance to ask Deborah some questions if you have them. I think this makes, I don't know, to me it made me think so much about that sort of dialectic between the connection and the control and where one ends and the other begins. It's very challenging. I sort of like to think that sometimes neither is there, but you tell me that's not true, that it's always one or the other. So
no, I say it's always both.
So do you all have any questions or thoughts?
I think someone has a microphone.
Yeah, I think you need to raise your hand and...
oh, there. Over there.
Well, I think for the people behind you, maybe it would be helpful. Oh, sorry, we have a couple. was that person who has the microphone first, and then we'll do you second, if that's okay.
No,
Just, why don't we just get the microphone to
it's coming
someone.
here, and then we'll go
There we
back.
go. Just right here.
Here, second row.
Right here. Yeah.
Can you hear me okay?
Much better.
I first want to give you a compliment. I went to AU, and
Oh,
I read your
great.
book when it very first came out, and it's brilliant. And my compliment to you is that after reading it, I wanted more, because it was almost like, you know, I don't know how much the book was, $10, but it was more therapy than it was linguistics, I felt, even though I know it was based on linguistics. My compliment to you is that I was so hungry for more that when the book came out, I don't know how much later, but Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus, and I bought it. It was so awful.
Thank you.
And I recognized, because of reading your book first, I was able to recognize what it was that I felt, in layman's terms, what was awful about it. And it was that your book was very much about all men and women have female and male traits in them. It's not that women are this and men are that. And I really appreciated that, because a lot of your traits that you highlight as being male, not necessarily in all men, but being male, I actually have. And so I really appreciated that you showed that there was this mix in all genders. His book incensed me because he kept making these definitive statements, dividing men are like this and women are like that, and I really thought it was incorrect, and I don't know if you read any of it, but it's not worth reading. So a compliment to you. Your book
Thank you. I
was really
appreciate that.
brilliant. My question to you is something on the apology subject, and more from the sense of linguistics and the application of the word sorry versus apologize. I had an incident happen with a manager years ago where I gave a customer the wrong change by accident. I mean, it was innocent, and they accused me of trying to keep the extra money, and I was really embarrassed, and I said, oh, I'm so sorry, I really didn't mean it, I got them their change right away. And my manager saw this happen and said, you obviously were innocent, but by coming off and saying, you know, I'm sorry, made you look guilty, and if that happens again, you should say, I apologize versus I'm sorry. And her whole thing was that I apologize, recognize that I've created an inconvenience, whereas if I say I'm sorry, I've actually admitted that maybe I was trying to keep your extra money. From your perspective,
You can
as
see
a-
I'm rolling my eyes here.
Is there a difference between
Is your boss in the
sorry?
room?
No.
Okay, good, then I'll tell you what I think. First of all, I'm puzzled because people typically do say the opposite. They say that I'm sorry does not really admit fault. It just kind of, I regret that happened, whereas I apologize literally means I am at fault. But my suspicion is that people don't really make that big distinction between apologize and sorry. I think in real life, we tend to take them both the same way. And I think you did the right thing. If you take admission of fault, if you take it as a literal admission of fault, yes, that can be the impression, and that's what lies behind insurance companies telling us never to apologize. But in actual human relations, most people appreciate the apology and are quite more likely to be angry and unforgiving if it doesn't come. So I think you did the right thing, and your boss gave you bad advice. But it can vary, of course, by individuals. I mean, it could be that you're talking to a particular person who is likely to take it that way. And again, it is not, and as you say, I never say anything absolute, male, female, but I think it tends to be more men than women that take the more literal interpretation of the apology as a true admission of fault. Yes?
Thank you very much, Dr. Tannen. Fascinating.
Thank you.
I'd like to go back to a topic that Ambassador Schneider raised, and that's about intercultural communications. And I, like very many in the audience, are struggling with trying to be a foreigner in the Dutch society, and specifically I'm dealing with my Dutch in-laws. And
Are they in the room?
they are not. Gott sei Dank. And I don't even know exactly how to phrase my question, otherwise I might have better communication with them. But I guess you pointed out that there were certainly differences in the Japanese culture and how they related to each other in American and that sort of thing. I'm trying to understand how much are the meta messages, so the underlying messages, the same between cultures, or are they actually different? So you can't even try to use your own cultural background on understanding those meta messages. One example that I'll give is the giving of Christmas presents. In American society, you give a Christmas present, you're quite effusive about it when you receive it, and then you circle back and you compliment the giver several times during the day, and you make an effort to circle back on it over probably the next months or even the next years. When you give a Christmas present to a Dutch person, they say thank you, they look at it and they put it down, and you never hear about it again. Can you enlighten how you feel about intercultural communication?
That specific is new to me, but let me say something about what happens across culture. As I said, my first husband was Greek, and I lived in Greece for a number of years, so I have that perspective. It's not that the meta messages are different, but the signals that signal the meta messages are different. What level, and it starts from the smallest cues. How loudly or softly is a normal tone of voice? How close or far do you stand when you speak? How long a pause do you leave between one person's turn and the next? Is it appropriate to talk along with somebody else? And this is the kind of thing that causes great havoc between couples. So someone, let's say Italian, Greek, Eastern European, East Coast of the United States, might think if you really are inspired by what someone's saying, you talk along with them to show enthusiasm. But you do that with someone who thinks only one voice should be heard at a time, they think you're interrupting them and stealing the floor. So they stop speaking. And then you don't know why they stop speaking, but because you want to be a good person, you fill in the blank. You fill in the space. And then pretty soon you're doing all the talking and they accuse you, and you don't know why they don't like you and why they don't talk to you. This can happen between any two cultures when there's a slight difference. Do you ask questions to show interest, or is asking questions intrusive? And so you get the complaint, on the one hand, your parents are not interested in me, they don't ask me anything. Or having dinner with your parents is like having dinner with the FBI. They interrogate me. All of these kinds of things, and the kinds of customs you're mentioning, how do you show interest, how do you show, the opposite is different, very different from culture to culture. And I don't think anyone can give you a guidebook, but you can become attuned. And it's so important not to take things too literally. I'll give two very quick examples. A woman from India whose son married an American woman. And his sister, Indian, also lived in America. So she came to visit her daughter and her son, and as she was unpacking her suitcase, her daughter-in-law did what for an American would be polite, complimented all her possessions. Oh, what a beautiful sari. Oh, how lovely. Well, in India, some of you know, when you compliment something, the person has to give it to you. And so she later said to her daughter, "What kind of woman did he marry? She wants everything." So she took it literally as a request. And I'll give you an example from my own family. It's funny because my husband, my man I'm married to now, we've been together 16 years. Although he grew up in California and I grew up in New York City, we both come from Eastern European Jewish backgrounds, so fairly similar backgrounds. But his parents are quite different from my parents. They're much more reticent, and my family is more raucous and outgoing and talkative. And his parents had visited us, and they said, when they went back to California, "What can we send you? We want to send you something." And I said, "Well, if you insist, there's a kind of coffee that I used to get in California that I can't get on the East Coast. If you could send me some, it would be wonderful." And they sent me an entire carton of 12 pounds of coffee. And do you know I took offense? I thought they were doing it out of spite. It was so out of proportion to what I expected that I took it to mean, "You're so demanding, you want coffee, I'll give you coffee." And now that I know them better, I can't believe I would have thought such a thing. But it was just so unexpected, out of proportion, that I couldn't imagine it. Another thing, maybe similar to yours, it was their anniversary, and their family doesn't exchange gifts, and my family does. So I insisted we get them an elaborate anniversary gift, which I wrapped and left out for them when we went out that night. And when we came back, there was no note, nothing. And I was, again, really offended. I thought they didn't like it, and how rude not to say they liked it. And it turned out that they had not opened it. They were going to wait and open it when we were there. Well, my family would never wait to open a present. You know, the present is there, you rip it open. So you can have those kinds of differences even in the same culture, but of course it's more extreme in different cultures.
Yeah, I really appreciated your question about John Gray, because I read your book, You Just Don't Understand, and I also read John Gray, and I had a big fight with my girlfriend, because I love John Gray, because it's simple, straight to the point, and it's really easy to know what you have to do. When a woman asks you, do you want this? She really wants to say, hey, I want this. I mean, there were these very straight lines which really helped me to improve my quality.
So what are you doing here tonight then?
Yeah. So, on the other hand, your book was brilliant. I mean, his was simple, straight, and to the point. Your book was brilliant. It was totally inclusive. It had many different levels of communication. And at the end, I was just confused and to struggle, how do I apply this to my real life? So I just wanted to
thank you.
give you this.
I think that's a compliment, thank you.
It's a big compliment. So I had a simple question. So one, what do you, did you ever meet him, and did you enjoy talking to each other? What do you think of him? And the second question, I actually have three, but the second question is, I also really was triggered by your comment about how much women communicate and how much men communicate, and the difference in amount of words which we use during the day. And then, you know, especially when you come home, I feel my words have all disappeared during the day, and my girlfriend has plenty left. And then
no, actually, she's just starting.
That's the idea I have. I wondered if you could give me some comments on how you coped with that, and then if you still have energy, I really have a very tough one for you. You talk about Japanese, you talk about Indians, of course after the 11th of September, but also before that, where you have this whole Muslim world, and we have the Western world, and whatever. Did you also make preparations to study those intercultural linguistic differences? Because that sounds like something which needs to happen.
I'll answer your three questions in reverse order, if I can remember all three, being over 50. Cross-cultural communication is actually where I started. My book, That's Not What I Meant, is really about cross-cultural differences, and in some cases I'm specific about the cultures that do things different ways, and in some cases I just lay out the parameters of the kinds of things that differ from one culture to the next. And much of my inspiration came from living in Greece and being married to a man from Greece. And so my start really was with that. The gender stuff for me came much later, and to me is just an instance of cross-cultural communication. To answer your question about the wordy woman and the silent man, in You Just Don't Understand, I talk about public and private speaking. It's in a public situation where, and obviously this didn't happen tonight, but frequently women will not speak much and men will speak more, and it's at home that men will speak less and women will speak more. And there's an anecdote I tell in You Just Don't Understand that actually happened, where I was invited to address a group of women and men. It was a small group in somebody's living room. And there was a couple sitting on the couch that was very noticeable because the entire evening he was the most talkative person in the group, and she never said anything, not once. And they were holding hands. And then toward the end of the evening, I made a comment about how women, for women, talking about personal things is the way you create connection, and women use talk in close relationships. And he raised his hand, he said, "That's absolutely right." And he pointed to her and he said, she's the talker in our family. And everybody burst out laughing. And he looked so hurt. He said, but it's true. At the end of the day, I come home and I have nothing to say, and she talks all evening, and if she didn't, we'd spend the evening in silence. And that really captured for me that difference, that the public situation where I was there and I was a guest, he felt it was his obligation to talk, he felt it was his privilege to talk maybe, and he felt comfortable talking. And I think on some level he thought he was making a contribution. And I say that frequently at home, it's a very different attitude toward the end of the day. He feels I've had to talk all day to make sure that I get the respect I deserve, that I have challenged people when I had to, that I've shown people that I know something and I need to be reckoned with. And now I'm home with somebody who loves me, I have nothing to prove, I'm free not to talk. And she feels all day I've had to watch what I say, because if I talk too much, they'll think I'm too aggressive, and if I say the wrong thing, I might hurt somebody's feelings or I might spark a conflict. And now I'm home with somebody I love and I'm comfortable, I'm free to talk. So I think the role of talk in a close relationship is different for women and men. That for many men, just being together means you're close. And you don't need to talk to prove anything. And for many women, talk, and the way I say this over and over, my mother even laughs at it, talk is the glue that holds a relationship together for many women. And I'll tell you an anecdote that's new in this book. After the book You Just Didn't Understand was published, I was riding in a taxi, and the taxi driver asked me where I was going, and I said I was going to talk about this, and he asked me what the book was about, and I told him. And he said, my wife and I have good communication. Oh, I thought, this is wonderful. And then he said, but sometimes when she talks to me, I just don't answer. And I thought, that doesn't sound so good. And I said, why wouldn't you answer? And he said, well, what she says just doesn't make any sense. I said, could you give me an example? He said, well, one evening I'm watching the ball game. So right here is a problem, right? He thinks watching the ball game is a good thing to do together. And he said, and she interrupted, she said to me, what should my brother do? And he looked at me in the rear view mirror and he said, her brother's 35, why should I give him advice? And I am quite certain that what happened was he was happy just watching television and she felt we should talk. And if we're not talking, we're not together. And what should we talk about? Well, problems, that's a good thing to talk about. Well, she didn't have any problems, so she borrowed her brother's problems. And it's not about advice, it's not about telling him what to do, it's just about being together. And the very fact that he would say, her brother's 35, why should I give him advice, shows that from his point of view, if you need advice, you're putting yourself in a one-down position. So that's why he's not going to talk about his problems, because he doesn't want to present himself as someone who needs help. That's a long answer. Oh, and John Gray. What do I think of John Gray? I make a big confession that I haven't read his books. But people frequently tell me that when they read my books, if they've read mine first and then they read his, they suspect perhaps he borrowed a bit. Because You Just Didn't Understand had already been on the bestseller list for a couple of years when he wrote his book. So that, what can you do? I'd rather he hadn't, but that's life. I guess my biggest concern is that the Mars-Venus terminology has sort of made the whole thing a bit of a joke. And I'm a little uncomfortable about that. But, look, if people like it and it's helpful to them, then you can't complain.
I think we have time for probably one more question, or two, maybe one or two. We've got some in the back, too.
Hi. Thank you very much for speaking. And thank you, doctors.
Thank you.
This pertains to the question that you were speaking about. A lot of times I ask people questions, and they don't answer the question. They answer something a little bit to the side. I don't know if you understand that, but I ask a question like, where did you go? And they say something about something else. And it happens so often. I sound like a very aggressive person saying, you didn't answer my question, you didn't answer my question, until finally I get an answer. But I find a lot of people doing that. Can you talk about that?
My suspicion is that they are speaking to what they perceive to be the meta message. My husband does that. I've gotten used to it. At the beginning it irritated me. He will answer what he thinks is my hidden motive. And when it is the hidden motive, I don't mind too much, but when it's not the hidden motive, then it's annoying. But that's my guess, that they are speaking to what they think is your implication. And what can you do about it? It depends on your relationship. I mean, if it's someone you're really close to, you could talk about it and say, I would just prefer you really answer. But if it's not someone you know well, you're right. If you say you didn't answer the question, you're changing the frame of the conversation to a more belligerent one, and you might not want to do that.
Hi, I'm Christina. I recently moved to Amsterdam from Washington D.C. So
Uh-huh.
I'm familiar with your current homes, and I'm familiar with your work, Dr. Tannen, for my graduate work, specifically talking from 9 to 5.
How nice.
I have a question over messaging and meta-messaging, but I first proceeded with a little bit of a story that will also touch on Dutch culture and what it's like for me, being an American living here. One of the things I greatly appreciate about Dutch culture, Dutch communication style, is its directness. And I'm sure this is no surprise for anyone in the audience who's either of Dutch descent or of another descent. But anyway, I recently went to the dentist for my first time here. And I'm used to going to the dentist twice a year because that's what us Americans do. We get a card in the mail and it says it's time for you to go to the dentist. So you go to the dentist to get your teeth cleaned. So I go to the dentist, and she says, why are you here? And I said, well, I need my teeth cleaned. So she pokes around a little bit and says, there's nothing to clean. Okay. I said, well, that's fine. I said, I'm used to getting my teeth cleaned twice a year. I said, maybe that's an American thing. How frequently do you do it here? She's like, well, you Americans, those dentists are all about money. And she goes on about the commercialism in dentistry in America. And so I'm laying in the chair, of course, my mouth wide open, with her picking away at my teeth, trying to find something to clean when there's nothing to clean. And then she says to me, but I can fix your teeth. Your teeth are ugly. I'm not kidding. This happens to me. And so I'm really about ready to come out of the chair at her at this point, because I'm like, this woman just told me my teeth are ugly. And then I'm like, no, wait, she's Dutch. It's okay. This is just the way she is. This is her being direct. And what she's trying to tell me is that she can help me to improve the way my teeth look. I'm sure you'll all want to see my teeth after this. And I leave there feeling terrible. But the reason why I'm feeling terrible is not so much about what the dentist thinks about my teeth, but it reminds me of what my mother always says about my teeth. My mother always says to me, you have such a beautiful smile, but you should fix your teeth. And this goes back a long way. It's a bad dental job that I had, but it always comes back to my mother and her comments about my teeth. So I hear the message, and the meta message to me from my mother is criticism. But there's another level to that, and that's where my question comes in, is that I hear the criticism, but what I feel inside is that a part of me is being rejected. A part of me is being told that I'm not lovable, I'm not good enough. And so do you talk in your latest book, which I have not read yet, about that level of emotion that these kinds of messages are touching on?
Thank you for the anecdote and the question. Yes, I do talk about it in just those terms, that the reason when the mother says, I don't know what's wrong with her, I can't open my mouth, she's right, that children, in particular seems to be mothers and daughters, but to an extent, children and parents, we are oversensitive to any criticism because we want that unconditional approval, and we feel, if you, who care so much about me and knows me so well, if you find me wanting, who is going to love me? There is that level of, I must really be a very unlovable person if even my mother finds these things wrong. And the irony is that it's especially your mother that finds things wrong, because in a way, our mothers and parents in general, again, we represent them to the world. And the better we look, the better she looks. When you said that, though, I thought of something that I hadn't thought of before, and maybe this, in a way, explains a paradox within the United States, at least. There are many things wrong with us that only our mothers will tell us, because most Americans won't tell you. Can I tell your anecdote, Anna? Well, somebody here was just saying about that her daughter, who lives in the United States, said it's such a pleasure to come back to Holland. I know I don't look well, and my friends in Holland will say, "You look terrible. What is wrong?" Whereas Americans will say, "You look lovely," and you say, "No, I don't. I feel terrible." "Oh no, you look great," and you know it's not true. But as an American, I appreciate that. I would rather people tell me I look great, whether I do or not. And that may be the reason we feel our mothers are so critical, is that they're the only ones that will tell us. And maybe here, everyone's telling you, and it's not so shocking. I wonder about that.
Can there be caring messages without criticism?
I think they are all caring. And, well, let me say, as I say, I think no statement has only one level. It's not a matter of caring or criticizing, it's always both. It's not a matter of connection or control, it's always both. It is true, and I don't think it is just American. I quote a woman from Thailand who said that her mother would sit her down, tell her everything that's wrong with her, and say, "Nobody else will tell you because they don't care." There is a level on which it's because we care, but that doesn't mean it's not hurtful. And we always have to find that right balance between what do we need to say because we care, and what should we hold back so that it doesn't come across as criticism.
You can turn yourself to me. Well, thank you so much, Deborah. That was really, really wonderful. I'm going to let Monique come up and close the evening, but Dr. Tannen will be available for signing her books immediately afterwards at the Athenaeum across the street. And you have to all go read this book.
Thank you all very much.
Well, there's a lot to learn, I think. I have to say, we had John Gray once, and I think we'll keep it to that. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Tannen, for your, I think, moving talk, and the insights you gave us make me behave a little bit different with Christmas. And I hope a little bit better. But thank you, Dr. Schneider, for your clear introduction and your well-chosen remarks and questions. I think we should consider inviting you again, Deborah, because I think the questions of the audience were quite relevant too there. Well, as I said earlier, Dr. Tannen, and as Dr. Schneider also mentioned, will sign her books in a moment. And since this is a church, Athenaeum bookstore, our partner, will not sell the books in here, but just in their shop across the street. The bookshop is kind enough to postpone their closing time, so you have all the time you need. And Deborah Tannen will sign books inside the shop. And I just heard that the University of Amsterdam is kind enough to have offer a reception for all the other people who have to wait, and there is a reception in the Tetrarode Bibliotheek right after I go up the stage. So, apart from thanking the university, I would like to stress the gratitude of the John Adams Institute towards the publishing house Prometheus Bakker for making this event possible. Without your support, we couldn't have made it. This brings me to the last remark I would like to make. The John Adams Institute next lecture is on January 10th, 2002, with another author of publishing house Prometheus Bakker. That's a coincidence. Jonathan Franzen. Franzen won the National Book Award this year, and I recommend everybody who hasn't read the corrections yet to do this during the holidays. And I would also encourage you to book your ticket for the lecture right away, because it's going to be a full house, and as soon as you contact us anyway, you should be aware you are very welcome to support our lecture series by becoming a donor for only 20 euros a year. You will receive our updates and news, and we continue to bring the best American lectures here in Amsterdam. Have a safe trip home and enjoy your holidays. Thank you so much.